At her birthday party, her millionaire husband slapped her, but her cold laugh and a shocking gift crushed his pride instantly. "Hi, my beautiful family, may the Almighty cover you in oceans of His mercy, lighting your path with the sun's first kiss, wrapping your nights in the velvet of peace, and filling your hearts with a love so pure it shakes the heavens. May every burden turn into a crown of strength, every tear into rivers of joy, and may His mighty hand guard you in every step you take. Amen." If you're here with me now, comment "present." If you feel the fire of our unbreakable bond, comment "I am with Mr. Peter." To my beloved family, your loyalty is my heartbeat. And to those here for the very first time, welcome to a place where stories are not just told, they are felt. But please watch the full story, because when you skip, it wounds my heart, damages our channel's name, and makes my hard work feel unseen. Don't forget to like and subscribe, because every like, every comment is a spark that keeps this great family's light burning bright across the world. The laugh that would end everything started as a tremor in Aisha Dean Pratt's chest, rising through her throat like a bird breaking free from a cage she hadn't known existed until that very moment. The moment her husband's palm connected with her face in front of everyone who pretended to matter in their glittering, hollow world. The Pratt mansion gleamed with calculated perfection that January evening, every surface reflecting the warm glow of 1,000 fairy lights strung for Aisha's 28th birthday party. Crystal champagne flutes caught the light like promises, and the air hummed with the kind of restrained elegance that cost more than most people's annual salaries. Aisha stood in the center of it all, wearing the ivory silk dress Aiden had selected for her. Not chosen, selected, the way one might select wallpaper or a decorative vase. She'd spent 3 hours that afternoon having her hair professionally straightened, the hot comb erasing her natural curls with the same efficiency that 5 years of marriage had erased other parts of herself. The makeup artist had been instructed by Aiden's assistant, not by Aisha, to keep things classic and understated, nothing too bold, nothing too ethnic, nothing too much like herself. "You look perfect," Aiden had said earlier, adjusting her diamond necklace with the mechanical precision of someone arranging a display. He hadn't looked at her eyes when he said it. He rarely did anymore, too busy scanning his phone for market updates or checking his reflection in surfaces that threw back the image of success he'd cultivated. The kind of man who owned things, including the beautiful black woman on his arm who'd learned to smile just so, speak just enough, exist just right. The party swirled around them in carefully choreographed chaos. There was Gabriel, Aiden's younger brother, nursing his third scotch by the piano nobody played anymore. Aisha used to play, before Aiden mentioned it was a bit much when she got lost in the music. There was Naomi Rivers, Aisha's best friend from art school, the only person in the room whose smile reached her eyes when she looked at Aisha. The only one who remembered when Aisha's paintings used to explode with color instead of hanging in storage, covered in sheets like corpses. And there, arriving fashionably late in a red dress that cost more than hope, was Sophia Winters. Aiden's ex-fiancée moved through the party like blood through water, her presence changing the chemical composition of everything it touched. She'd been invited, of course. Aiden insisted on maintaining professional relationships, and Sophia's family owned the second-largest tech distribution network on the East Coast. But everyone knew the real reason she came to these gatherings, to remind Aisha that she was the replacement, never the first choice. "Happy birthday, Aisha," Sophia purred, air-kissing with the precision of a snake strike. 28, isn't it? I remember when Aiden and I were that young. We had such dreams then." Her eyes flicked to Aiden, who was deep in conversation with potential investors, his hand absently resting on Aisha's lower back like she was furniture he was leaning against. Aisha felt the familiar shrinking sensation, the way she always did around Sophia. But tonight, something else stirred beneath it. Maybe it was the wine. She'd had 3 glasses, more than Aidan usually approved of. Maybe it was the envelope hidden in her clutch, the one that had arrived that morning from the Marseille art residency. Maybe it was simply that 28 years felt like enough time to have been disappearing. "We should make a toast," Sophia announced, her voice cutting through conversations like a scalpel. "To our birthday girl." The room turned toward them, a sea of faces that knew Aisha's name but not her story, who'd eaten at her table but never asked about the paint stains she used to hide under her fingernails. Aidan materialized beside her, his hand tightening on her waist, a warning disguised as affection. "Before we toast," Aisha heard herself saying, her voice strange and distant in her own ears, "I have an announcement." The room quieted. Aidan's fingers pressed harder into her side. She could feel his tension radiating like heat from a fever, but she continued, pulling the envelope from her clutch with fingers that didn't shake. Not anymore. "I've been accepted to the Marseille art residency in Paris," she said, the words falling into the silence like stones into still water. "It's a 6-month program for emerging artists. I'll be leaving next month." The silence stretched, taut as a held breath. She felt Aidan go rigid beside her, saw Sophia's lips curl into a smile sharp enough to draw blood. "You applied without discussing it with me?" Aidan's voice was low, controlled, but Aisha knew that tone. It was the voice he used before acquisition meetings, before destroying competitors, before everything fell apart. "I applied 2 years ago," Aisha replied, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. "Before you told me art was just a hobby, before you converted my studio into your home gym, before I stopped being Aisha and became Mrs. Pratt." Someone gasped. Champagne glasses hung suspended in mid-air like question marks. Sophia laughed, the sound tinkling through the tension like broken glass. "Can't control your wife, Aidan?" Sophia said, her voice carrying the particular cruelty of someone who knew exactly where to insert the knife. "How unlike you. The Aidan I knew never let anything slip through his fingers." That's when Aisha saw it, the moment Aidan stopped being her husband and became the man his father had been, the man his grandfather had been, the kind of man who owned things and broke them when they didn't perform as expected. His face flushed red, then white, then red again. His hand left her waist, rose into the air, and connected with her cheek with a sound that would echo in that room long after the party ended. The slap wasn't hard. Aidan was many things, but physically violent had never been one of them. It was the publicness of it, the casual ownership of the gesture, the way he did it almost absently, like correcting a malfunctioning appliance, that made it devastating. For a moment, the world stopped. Aisha felt the sting on her cheek, saw the horror dawning in some faces, the satisfaction in others, the way Sophia's smile widened like a wound. She saw Naomi start forward, saw Gabriel drop his glass, saw her own reflection in the mirror across the room. A woman she didn't recognize, someone who'd been slapped at her own birthday party by a man who'd sworn to love her. And then, from somewhere deep inside, from the place where she'd buried the girl who used to paint sunrises and dance in rainstorms and laugh with her whole body, something broke free. The laugh started soft, almost inaudible, then grew like a symphony, finding its rhythm. It wasn't bitter or hysterical. It was the laugh of recognition, of clarity, of a woman finally understanding the punchline to a joke she'd been living for 5 years. It filled the room, warm and rich and absolutely devastatingly free. "Thank you," she said to Aidan, whose hand still hung in the air like he'd forgotten it belonged to him. "Thank you for finally showing me the truth." She looked around the room, at these people who'd watched her diminish herself course by course, dinner party by dinner party, like entertainment. "You just freed me from pretending this marriage works," she continued, her voice carrying the kind of authority she'd forgotten she possessed. "You see, I've been dying so slowly, so quietly, that I'd forgotten I was supposed to be alive. But this, she touched her cheek, still smiling, this is so honest, so public, so perfectly, undeniably clear. She stepped away from Aidan, who seemed frozen, his face cycling through emotions like a broken television. The crowd parted as she moved toward the door, her laugh still echoing in the crystal and silver and all the beautiful, empty things that had been her life. "Where are you going?" Aidan finally managed, his voice cracking like a teenager's. Aisha turned at the doorway, and in that moment, with her cheek reddening and her eyes bright as stars, she was the most beautiful thing in that room full of beautiful things. But it was a beauty that belonged to her alone, not to be possessed or displayed or diminished. "I'm going to remember who I was before I forgot," she said. "I'm going to paint with all the colors you taught me to hide. I'm going to laugh with my whole body instead of that polite little sound you approved of. I'm going to be so magnificently myself that this moment, this slap, this party will seem like a small price to pay for my freedom." She looked directly at Sophia then, whose smile had faltered. "And you? You can have him. Consider it my birthday gift to myself, letting go of things that were never really mine." The last thing she said, standing in the doorway of the mansion she'd called home but had never been home, was directed at the room but meant for herself. That laugh you just heard, that was the sound of Aisha Dean coming back to life. Remember it, because you'll never hear anything that beautiful in this house again. And then she was gone, leaving behind only the echo of her laughter and a room full of people who would spend the rest of their lives trying to forget the night they watched a woman resurrect herself with joy instead of tears, with laughter instead of shame, with a freedom so complete it made their own cages visible. Aidan stood in the center of his perfect party, his hand still tingling from the slap, his ears still ringing with her laugh, knowing with absolute certainty that he'd just made the worst mistake of his life. And somewhere in the distance, getting farther away with each passing second, Aisha Dean walked into the night, her laughter carrying on the wind like a promise of everything she was about to become. Chapter 2. The Empty Mansion. Aidan Pratt woke to a silence so complete it felt like drowning in reverse. Instead of water filling his lungs, it was emptiness, vast and suffocating, pressing against him from all sides of the California king bed that suddenly seemed infinite without Aisha's warmth beside him. The morning light filtered through curtains she'd chosen, ivory silk with the faintest thread of gold running through them, something about bringing warmth to cold spaces, she'd said. He hadn't really listened then, too busy reviewing quarterly projections on his tablet while she held fabric samples up to the window. Now, in the harsh clarity of his hangover and the sharper clarity of what he'd done, every detail she'd ever tried to share with him seemed to matter desperately. His hand throbbed with a pain that had nothing to do with physical impact and everything to do with the phantom sensation of her cheek against his palm. He'd hit his wife at her birthday party, in front of everyone who mattered in their social circle and, more importantly, in front of the one person who mattered most, Aisha herself. The laugh. God, that laugh. It played on repeat in his mind like a broken record, each iteration revealing new layers of meaning. Not bitter, not broken, liberated. That's what terrified him most. She'd laughed like someone who'd just discovered the door to their prison had been unlocked all along. He reached for his phone, that familiar lifeline to a world he could control, but found instead a handwritten note on her pillow. Aisha's handwriting, the cursive loops he'd once called charmingly old-fashioned, while suggesting she might want to type important things instead. "Aidan, the movers will come at noon. Please don't make this harder than it needs to be. I left my journal on your desk, not for reconciliation, but for understanding. You were never cruel, just absent. Sometimes that's worse." AD, not AP. She'd already shed his name, like an ill-fitting coat. He stumbled from the bed, his feet finding the cold marble floor that Aisha had wanted to cover with Persian rugs. For warmth, she'd said, but he'd insisted on keeping the surfaces clean, minimal, controlled. The house felt like a mausoleum now, all sharp edges and reflective surfaces throwing back versions of himself he didn't want to see. Her studio, no, his home gym, stood empty of her presence, but full of her absence. The treadmill and weights he'd installed seemed like intruders now, corporate invaders in what had been her sacred space. But there, in the corner where the mirror met the wall, a streak of cerulean paint remained, a rebel fragment of color in his monochrome world. He touched it, and his finger came away clean, long-dried, probably years old, a fossil of the woman she used to be. The journal waited on his desk like an accusation bound in leather. He'd given it to her for their first anniversary, inscribed with, "For your thoughts, AP." He opened it with hands that shook like autumn leaves, and her world spilled out in watercolor words and sketched margins. Year 1. He says I laugh too loudly. I'm learning to modulate. Marriage is about compromise. Year 2. Aidan suggested I skip the gallery opening. He's right. Those events run so late, and he needs me fresh for the Henderson dinner. My art will wait. Year 3. I paint at 3 a.m. now. The sunrise through the kitchen window turns everything gold. Aidan sleeps through it. Maybe that's better. My joy feels too large for daylight lately. Year 4. Sophia came to lunch today. She told me about the trips they used to take, the way he used to look at her paintings. She painted too, apparently. I wonder if he asked her to stop as well, or if I'm special in my diminishment. Year 5. I am disappearing. Not dramatically, not all at once, but pixel by pixel, like a photograph fading in reverse. Yesterday, I couldn't remember the last time I mixed colors just to see what would happen. Today, Aidan told me I look perfect. I wanted to scream that perfect things are dead things, but I smiled instead. I'm becoming excellent at smiling. The final entry was from yesterday, hours before the party. The acceptance letter came. Paris wants me. My old professor wrote that my portfolio showed a hunger that could reshape contemporary art. I laughed until I cried, then cried until I couldn't breathe. I'm going to tell him tonight. Either he'll see me, finally see me, or he'll show me who he really is. Either way, I'll be free. Aidan set the journal down with the care of someone handling explosives. His phone buzzed. 43 messages, 18 missed calls. The board, the investors, Sophia, of course. Her message simply a champagne emoji and a question mark, but nothing from Aisha. The doorbell rang. Not movers. It was only 9 a.m. He descended the stairs, each step echoing in the vast foyer they'd argued about. She'd wanted something cozier. He'd insisted on grandeur. Joseph and Grace Dean stood at his door, Aisha's parents, looking at him with eyes that held no forgiveness. Joseph Dean was a tall man who carried himself like royalty despite driving a 15-year-old Honda. Grace stood beside him, her natural hair a silver crown, her posture suggesting she'd rather be anywhere else but was here for duty. They looked like what Aisha would become if she'd been allowed to age into herself instead of into Mrs. Pratt. "We're here for her things," Joseph said, his voice the kind of deep that came from years of speaking truth, whether people wanted to hear it or not. "The movers," Aidan started. "We cancelled them," Grace interrupted, the first time she'd ever interrupted him in 5 years. "Our daughter's life isn't something to be handled by strangers. We'll take what matters. You can keep what you paid for." They moved through his house like archaeologists, recovering artifacts from a lost civilization. They took her paintings from storage, handling each canvas like recovered treasure. They took her grandmother's sewing box, the one he'd suggested might look better in the attic. They took the succulent garden she'd cultivated on the kitchen windowsill, the one sign of life in his sterile kitchen. "She painted this the night before your wedding," Grace said, holding up a canvas Aidan had never seen. A woman dissolving into light, her face turned away, but her body language suggesting either departure or arrival. He couldn't tell which. "She was going to show you, but you had that conference call. Remember, the one that couldn't wait." He remembered. The Tokyo merger. It had seemed so important then. Gabriel arrived as they were loading the last box, his younger brother looking disheveled and smelling of scotch despite the early hour. "Jesus, Aidan," Gabriel said, watching the dismantling of a marriage in cardboard boxes. "You actually did it. You actually became Dad." Their father, William Pratt, had been a titan of industry who died at his desk. His third wife, not their mother, finding him slumped over acquisition papers. He'd been successful by every metric that mattered to Wall Street and a failure by every metric that mattered to human hearts. "Where is she?" Aidan asked his brother, knowing Gabriel and Aisha had maintained a friendship despite Aidan's subtle discouragement. "Somewhere you can't follow her with your checkbook," Gabriel replied. "She's with Naomi, and before you ask, no, I won't tell you where. You need to sit with this, brother. You need to feel what it's like when the thing you took for granted stops existing." Joseph paused at the door, the last box in his arms. "We warned her," he said, not unkindly, but with the weight of prophecy fulfilled. "We said money couldn't buy respect, but she loved you, believed you'd see her eventually." He shook his head. "That laugh last night? That wasn't heartbreak, son. That was recognition. She finally saw what we'd seen all along. You're a man who collects beautiful things but doesn't know how to love them." After they left, Aidan stood in his empty mansion, not empty of furniture, but empty of her essence, which he was only now realizing had been the thing that made it home. His phone rang, the board. "Pratt, we need to discuss last night," Harrison Wells, the board chairman, said without preamble. "The video is already circulating." "What video?" "Someone filmed it. The slap, her speech, that laugh. It's on social media. The optics are problematic." Aidan found the video within seconds. Someone, he couldn't tell who, had captured everything from the moment Aisha announced Paris to her exit. The comments were brutal. "That laugh gave me life. She's free now." The way she said thank you after he hit her, iconic. "Anyone know her art? I want to support her work." He looks like every man who just realized what he lost. But it was Aisha's face in the video that destroyed him. In the moment before the slap, there had been hope in her eyes. She'd been looking at him, really looking, waiting to see if he'd surprise her, support her, see her. The slap had extinguished that hope, but it had ignited something else, a fierce, uncontainable joy at finally having proof of what she'd suspected all along. The house groaned around him, settling into its foundations, and Aidan realized it had never been their home. It had been his display case, and she had been the centerpiece, positioned just so, lit just right, never allowed to move lest she disturb the exhibition. He climbed the stairs to their bedroom, his bedroom now, and found one thing she'd left behind, her wedding ring, placed precisely in the center of his pillow, not thrown in anger, not hidden in spite, but placed with the same care she'd once used to arrange flowers he'd never noticed, to fold his shirts just how he liked them, to love him in ways he'd been too blind to see. The laugh echoed in the empty mansion, bouncing off marble and glass, finding no soft surface to absorb its truth. Aidan Pratt, master of acquisitions, captain of industry, man who'd built an empire on seeing opportunities others missed, sat on his perfect bed in his perfect house and finally understood the actual cost of perfection. It was the sound of a woman's laughter, walking away free. Chapter 3. The Separation Spectacle. Freedom, Aisha discovered, tasted like cheap coffee at 6 a.m. in Naomi's cramped apartment, where the walls were thin enough to hear the neighbors' dreams and the radiator clanged like a jazz drummer who'd lost the beat. And it was the most beautiful symphony she'd heard in years. She stood at the window, watching Harlem wake up below, her hands wrapped around a chipped mug that had more character than all the fine china in the Pratt mansion. The morning light hit different here, not filtered through expensive treatments, but raw and honest, painting everything in shades of possibility. Her reflection in the glass showed a woman she was still getting to know, hair spiraling free in its natural state, face bare of the carefully applied mask she'd worn for 5 years, cheek still faintly bruised, but somehow making her look more alive than perfect ever had. "You're painting with your eyes again," Naomi said from the doorway, dressed in paint-splattered overalls that cost nothing and said everything about a life lived in color. "I can always tell. Your fingers start twitching." It was true. Aisha's hands had begun moving of their own accord, muscle memory of holding brushes returning like a mother tongue she'd been forbidden to speak. She'd woken at 3 a.m., the only time she'd been allowed to be herself in the mansion, but instead of creeping to a hidden corner, she'd set up right in Naomi's living room, claiming space like a conquistador of her own existence. The painting had poured out of her like water breaking through a dam. A woman's silhouette dissolving into laughter, each ha becoming a bird taking flight, their wings made of all the words she'd swallowed over the years. She'd titled it simply, Day 1. "Vivian from the gallery called," Naomi said, settling beside her with her own coffee, black, strong, unapologetic. "She saw the video. Everyone's seen the video. She wants to discuss representation." The video. Aisha had watched it once, needing to see herself from the outside to believe it had really happened. There she was, announcing Paris with a voice that grew stronger with each word. There was Aiden, his face cycling through emotions like a man watching his stock portfolio crash. There was the slap, almost delicate in its violence, and there was her laugh, rising like a phoenix from the ashes of who she'd been. "She also said," Naomi continued carefully, "that Aiden's been calling, wanting to buy every piece you've ever shown there." "Of course he has," Aisha said unsurprised. "He thinks everything can be acquired, even redemption." Her phone, a new one, number unknown to the Pratt world, buzzed with notifications. Her Instagram, dormant for 3 years, Aiden had thought social media unseemly for his wife, had exploded overnight. Someone had found her old work, posting it with hashtag the laugh that saved her. 30,000 new followers in 12 hours. Messages from galleries, collectors, women who saw themselves in her story. But it was one message that stopped her cold. A simple text from an unknown number that she knew immediately was him. "Please come home. We can discuss this rationally." Rationally, as if their marriage had been a business contract with terms to be negotiated. She deleted it without responding, each swipe a small act of revolution. "The lawyer wants to meet today," she told Naomi. "Separation papers." "You sure you're ready?" Aisha looked at her painting, still wet, still becoming. "I've been ready for years. I just needed permission. Turns out the only person who could give it to me was me." The law offices of Williams and Associates occupied a floor of a building that breathed money, all mahogany and leather, and the kind of silence that cost extra. Aisha arrived in jeans and a blazer, her hair a natural cloud that seemed to take up space in a way that made the receptionist stare. She'd worn color, real color, not the muted tones of Mrs. Pratt, but a yellow that demanded to be seen. Aiden was already there, of course, 15 minutes early as always, dressed in a suit that probably cost more than most people's cars. He stood when she entered, manners his mother had drilled into him before she'd fled to Italy to escape his father. His eyes went immediately to her hair, then her clothes, then the absence of her wedding ring, cataloguing changes like a man studying a familiar painting that had been restored to its original version. "Aisha," he said, and she heard him swallow her married name like medicine. "Aidan," she replied, sitting without waiting for him to pull out her chair, another small rebellion that she saw register in his eyes. The lawyers began their dance of documents and divisions, but Aisha barely heard them. She was too busy watching Aidan try to control something that refused to be controlled. He'd brought flowers, white roses, expensive and scentless, the kind he always ordered for apologies. They sat between them like a surrender flag that didn't know the war was already over. "My client," Aidan's lawyer, a sharp-suited barracuda named Morrison, began, "is prepared to be generous. The prenuptial agreement notwithstanding, Mr. Pratt wishes to ensure Mrs. Pratt—" "Ms. Dean," Aisha interrupted, "I'll be using my maiden name." A muscle in Aidan's jaw twitched, control slipping pixel by pixel. "Ms. Dean," Morrison continued, consulting his notes, "is comfortable. A settlement of $2 million, the Mercedes, and—" "I don't want money," Aisha said, her voice cutting through the legal fog like morning light. "I want my paintings back. All of them. The ones in storage, the ones he bought before we married, the ones I created during. I want my grandmother's piano from the attic. I want my freedom, complete and unencumbered. He can keep everything else." "That's ridiculous," Aidan burst out, the first crack in his composure. "You're entitled to—" "To what?" Aisha turned to face him fully for the first time, and he flinched at what he saw in her eyes. Not anger, but absence, the complete evacuation of feeling where love used to live. "To half of things I never wanted, to be bought off like another acquisition. I'm not for sale, Aidan. I never was. That's what you never understood." She stood, pulling out her own folder, prepared by a lawyer friend of Naomi's who worked for a non-profit, not this tower of gold and greed. "Here are my terms," she said, placing the papers on the table with the same precision she'd once used to place his dinner just so. "I want nothing that was yours before. I want nothing that became ours during. I want only what was mine that I lost along the way. Sign it, and I'll be gone. Fight it, and I'll make this public in ways that will make that video look like a love letter." "You're being emotional," Morrison said, the condescension dripping like honey. "Perhaps we should reconvene when—" Aisha laughed. Not the transformative laugh from the party, but something smaller, sharper, a scalpel of sound that made Morrison step back. "Emotional," she repeated, tasting the word like wine. "Yes, I am. I'm feeling everything I wasn't allowed to feel for 5 years. Anger that tastes like copper, joy that feels like flying, freedom that sounds like—" She paused, smiled, laughter. "And you know what? It's magnificent." She moved toward the door, then stopped, looking back at Aidan, who sat frozen, those roses wilting between them like metaphors too obvious to ignore. "You'll sign," she said with quiet certainty. "Not because you love me. I don't think you know how to love anything you can't control. You'll sign because your board is already nervous, your investors are already whispering, and Sophia is already circling like a vulture in Versace. You'll sign because fighting me means admitting you were wrong, and you'd rather lose a wife than lose face." "I loved you," Aidan said, the words falling like stones into still water. "No," Aisha replied, her hand on the door. "You loved the idea of me, the beautiful black wife who proved you were progressive, the talented artist whose dreams you could afford to indulge as long as they stayed small, the woman who made you look good at parties. But me, the real me who painted at 3 a.m. and laughed too loud and cried at sunsets, you never even saw her." She left then, her footsteps echoing in the marble hallway like a countdown to something ending. Behind her, she heard Morrison asking Aidan what he wanted to do, heard the silence that followed, heard the sound of expensive roses being swept into a wastebasket. Outside, Harlem embraced her like a prodigal daughter returned. She walked past brownstones and bodegas, past kids playing hopscotch and old men playing dominoes, past life happening in all its messy, uncontrolled glory. Her phone buzzed. Vivian from the gallery. "Coffee tomorrow? I have a proposition. Your work, your story, your moment. We could create something revolutionary." Aisha texted back, "Yes." That night, she painted until her hands cramped, each stroke an act of reclamation. The painting showed a woman signing her name, not on a marriage certificate or divorce papers, but on her own skin, claiming herself with ink made of stardust and strength. She posted it on Instagram at exactly the time she used to serve Aiden dinner. The caption read, "Day 3 of the rest of my life. Learning that the opposite of disappearing isn't appearing for others, it's appearing for yourself." Within an hour, it had 10,000 likes and hundreds of comments from women sharing their own stories of becoming visible again. But the comment that mattered most came from an account with no picture, no followers, just a name, Aiden M. Pratt. It said simply, "I see you now." Aisha read it, considered it, then blocked the account without responding. Some revelations came too late to matter, like roses without scent or apologies without change. She picked up her brush again, dipped it in cerulean, the color of the paint streak in the home gym that used to be her studio, and began painting the tomorrow she'd been waiting for permission to want. Permission she'd finally given herself, signed with laughter instead of tears, witnessed by the world, and absolutely, irrevocably binding. Chapter 4. The Art Exhibition. 3 weeks after the slap heard round the Upper East Side, Aisha Dean stood in the center of the Morrison Gallery, watching her pain transform into other people's catharsis as strangers wept in front of her paintings like pilgrims at a shrine to every woman who'd ever made herself smaller to fit into someone else's life. The exhibition had come together with the speed of necessity, like a birth that couldn't wait for the perfect moment. Vivian Cross, the gallery owner who'd been watching Aisha disappear for years, had called it "the laugh that saved me," taking liberties with the viral hashtag, but understanding that salvation was always personal, always present tense, always happening right now for someone. The gallery space had been transformed into a timeline of a marriage's decay, each painting hung chronologically like evidence in a trial where the jury was everyone who'd ever loved someone who couldn't see them. The opening night had been invitation only, but somehow word had spread like wildfire through social media, and now there was a line around the block. Women and men, young and old, all coming to witness what it looked like when a woman painted her way back to herself. "The Times wants a statement," Vivian whispered, appearing at Aisha's elbow with 2 glasses of champagne that Aisha knew she wouldn't drink. She wanted to be completely present for this, no buffers, no softening edges. "My statement is on the walls," Aisha replied, watching a woman in her 60s stand transfixed before a painting called "Anniversary Dinner for One." A table set for 2 where one place setting slowly dissolved into shadow while the other blazed with lonely light. The paintings told the story better than words ever could. They began with "First Date," explosions of color, 2 figures dancing through a cosmos of possibility. Then came "Wedding Day," where the colors began to mute, the bride's face turned away from the viewer, as if already looking for exits. Year 1 showed a woman painting in a corner while a man's shadow fell across her canvas, darkening everything it touched. By year 3, the woman in the paintings had become translucent, visible only in outline, like someone had begun erasing her with careful, methodical strokes. But it was the final series that made people gasp, made them pull out their phones to capture images that would circulate through the internet like a modern gospel of redemption. 3 a.m. Truth. A woman painting in darkness, her brushstrokes creating their own light. The Question, hands holding an acceptance letter while everything around them held its breath. And finally, the centerpiece, the painting everyone came to see. The Laugh. She'd painted it in a fever over 3 days, barely sleeping, hardly eating, following the memory like a map to buried treasure. The painting showed a woman's face at the moment of impact, not the slap, which was relegated to a mere shadow at the edge of the frame, but the impact of realization. Her mouth was open in laughter, and from it poured not sound but color. Every shade she'd been denied, every hue she'd hidden, every tone she'd been told was too much. The laugh became a river, a flood, a biblical deluge of everything she'd kept contained, and in the background, barely visible unless you looked closely, was the shadow of a man drowning in the art he'd tried to suppress. "It's priced at 50,000, Vivian had said when they'd hung it. "It's not for sale," Aisha had replied. "That one's mine." Now, standing in the gallery, surrounded by her truth made visible, Aisha felt the particular weightlessness that came from having nothing left to hide. She'd worn red tonight, not burgundy, not wine, but red like fresh blood, like Valentine's, like stop signs. Her hair was styled in a crown of braids that added 3 inches to her height, and she'd lined her eyes with gold that caught the gallery lights like a promise to never be invisible again. "He's here." Naomi's voice cut through Aisha's reverie. She didn't need to ask who. She could feel Aidan's presence like a shift in barometric pressure, that particular weight he brought to any room, the way space reorganized itself around his importance. He stood just inside the entrance, and for a moment, Aisha saw him as her paintings must see him. A man confronted with the visual evidence of his own failures, each canvas a mirror reflecting back the husband he'd actually been, rather than the one he'd imagined himself to be. He wore all black, whether in mourning or trying to disappear she couldn't tell, and his face had the hollow look of someone who'd been feeding on regret for 3 weeks straight. Gabriel was with him, one hand on his brother's shoulder as if to keep him from fleeing or advancing. Aisha couldn't tell which. They began moving through the gallery, and Aisha tracked their progress by the whispers that followed, the way conversations stopped mid-sentence, the way people pulled out their phones to capture this. The slapper, viewing the slapped's response, hung on walls for public consumption. She watched him stop at year 2, the studio becomes a gym, which showed artists' supplies being slowly replaced by exercise equipment, easels morphing into treadmills, paint cans transforming into protein shakes. His hand went to his mouth, a gesture she'd never seen him make, too uncontrolled for his usual repertoire. At year 4 dinner party performance, he actually stepped back. The painting depicted a woman performing happiness at a long table, her smile so bright it cast shadows, while her real self sat underneath the table, knees pulled to chest, hands over ears, trying to disappear into the tablecloth's folds. Aisha had painted it after a particularly brutal evening with his colleagues, where she'd been asked to tell that funny story about growing up in Harlem 3 times, like she was a jukebox that played poverty for entertainment. But it was when he reached the question that something in him seemed to break. The painting showed the moment before, a woman holding an envelope, her face a battlefield between hope and experience, while a man in the background checked his phone, already absent before the conversation began. Aidan stared at it for so long that people began to gather, wanting to see what had transfixed him. "That's him," someone whispered, "the husband." "Oh my God, it is. The audacity. Should someone call security?" But Aisha had already begun walking toward him, the crowd parting like she was Moses, and they were the Red Sea of the curious and sympathetic. She felt every eye in the gallery follow her, everyone waiting to see what would happen when the woman who laughed met the man who'd struck her. "You came," she said simply, stopping just outside of his reach. A distance she calculated without thinking, muscle memory of 5 years of gauging his moods by proximity. "I had to see," Aidan replied, his voice hoarse like he'd been screaming or crying or possibly both. "I had to understand." "And do you?" She gestured to the walls around them. "Understand?" He looked at her, really looked, maybe for the first time since their wedding day, and she saw him catalogue the changes. the confidence in her posture that made her seem taller, the way she took up space now, unapologetically, the absence of the careful smile she'd worn like armor, the presence of something else, not happiness exactly, but the possibility of it, which was somehow more devastating. "I see what I did," he said slowly, "but I don't understand how I didn't see it while it was happening." "Because you weren't looking," Aisha replied, not unkindly but with the matter-of-factness of someone stating weather conditions. "You were busy seeing what you expected to see, the grateful wife, the appropriate partner, the successful acquisition." "You were never—" he started, but she held up her hand. "Yes, I was. Maybe not consciously, but yes. I was something you acquired to complete a picture. The problem was, I was a whole person, not a puzzle piece." Around them, people pretended not to watch while recording everything on their phones. This moment, too, would become part of the story. The confrontation in the gallery, the artist facing her subject, the laugher meeting the slapper among the evidence of their failed union. "The paintings," Aidan said, his voice breaking slightly. "They're all true, aren't they? Every one of them. This is how you experienced our marriage." "Yes." He moved to the centerpiece then, the laugh, and stood before it like a penitent at an altar. His hand rose as if to touch it, then fell back to his side. 50,000, he said, reading the price tag. "Not for sale. 100,000. "It's not for sale, Aidan. 200. "Stop." Her voice cut through his numbers like they were nothing, which they were. "You can't buy your way out of this. You can't acquire absolution. That painting stays with me because that moment stays with me. The good and the bad and the liberating truth of it all. I'm seeing a therapist," he offered, like it was currency in a transaction she hadn't agreed to. "Good. You should see several. I've taken a leave from the company. That's your journey, not mine. I love—" "Don't." This time, her voice was sharp, final. "Whatever you were about to say, don't. Love isn't past tense apologies or present tense grand gestures. Love is all the daily moments you missed, the accumulated seeing you didn't do. You can't love someone retroactively." Gabriel stepped forward then, gentle and careful. "We should go, Aidan." But Aidan wasn't finished. "The papers. I signed them. Everything you asked for. The paintings, the piano, the freedom. It's all yours." "It was always mine," Aisha replied. "You just had temporary custody." As the brothers turned to leave, Aidan stopped at the door, looking back at the gallery full of people who'd come to see his failures transformed into her triumph. "For what it's worth," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "that laugh was the most honest thing that happened in our entire marriage." "I know," Aisha replied. "That's why it saved me." After he left, the gallery seemed to exhale collectively. Sales were being finalized, interviews being requested, pictures being taken. But Aisha found herself standing again before the laugh, seeing it now not as the ending of something, but as the beginning. Ms. Dean, a young black woman, maybe 22, stood beside her, tears streaming down her face. "I just wanted to say, I'm getting married next month. I've been having doubts, little ones, about the way he talks about my dreams like they're hobbies, about how he schedules our time, about the way I've started to make myself quieter. I came here thinking I was being dramatic, but—" She gestured at the paintings. "This could be me in 5 years, couldn't it?" Aisha took the young woman's hands, feeling the weight of the moment, the responsibility of being someone's cautionary tale and inspiration simultaneously. "The only question that matters," Aisha said gently, "is this. Does he see you, or does he see who he needs you to be? And if you're not sure, paint it, write it, sing it, express it somehow, because the truth always shows up in the art we make when no one's watching." The young woman nodded, squeezed Aisha's hands, and walked out of the gallery with her phone already to her ear, having a conversation that would change her life's trajectory. Vivian appeared with a bottle of champagne. "Every painting except The Laugh has sold. You're officially a sensation. The Times, The New Yorker, Art Forum, everyone wants an interview." But Aisha was looking at her phone, at a new message from the Marseille Art Residency. "We've been following your story. Your spot is still available, but we suspect you might not need us anymore. You've already become what we hoped to help you discover." She laughed then, not the laugh that had freed her, but a new one, smaller and sweeter. The laugh of someone who'd learned that sometimes the best revenge isn't success or money or even public vindication. Sometimes it's simply becoming exactly who you were always meant to be, painting it for the world to see, and hanging a "not for sale" sign on the moment you finally chose yourself. Chapter 5. The Parallel Live spring arrived in New York, like forgiveness nobody had asked for, but everyone needed, painting the city in shades of possibility that made even the concrete seem willing to bloom. And in this season of renewal, Aisha Dean and Aidan Pratt lived in the same city but different worlds, their lives running parallel like train tracks that would never meet unless something derailed them both. Aisha woke each morning in her new studio apartment in Bedford-Stuyvesant, a space so small that her bed doubled as storage for canvases, but so completely hers that every square inch felt like territory reclaimed from an occupying force. Sunlight flooded through windows she never covered. No more ivory silk curtains to filter reality into something more palatable. She'd painted one wall midnight blue and covered it with gold constellations, a map of everywhere she planned to go now that she was no longer tethered to someone else's orbit. Her days had developed a rhythm that felt like jazz, structured but improvisational, planned but open to possibility. Mornings meant teaching art to children at the community center 3 blocks away, their faces lighting up when Ms. Aisha showed them how to mix colors that didn't exist until they created them. Afternoons were for her own work, paintings that grew bolder with each passing day, as if making up for years of enforced subtlety. Evenings brought different adventures. Gallery openings where people knew her name, dinner parties where she laughed without measuring the volume, dates with men who saw her art before they saw her beauty, though none of them stayed longer than a season, and that was fine. She was learning to be her own permanent resident. Across town, in the mansion that felt more mausoleum than home, Aidan Pratt was discovering what happened when you removed the center from something that had been built around it. Everything collapsed inward, like a dying star, leaving a black hole that consumed light, time, and any attempt at normal function. He'd kept his leave of absence from the company despite the board's protests, letting Gabriel handle the daily operations while he tried to figure out who he was when he wasn't acquiring things. The house staff had been reduced to just Celia, the housekeeper who'd worked for his family for 20 years, and who now looked at him with the kind of pity reserved for people who'd lost something they'd never truly possessed. His days had structure but no meaning. Therapy at 9, Dr. Vivian Cross, who'd been recommended by Gabriel and who had a way of asking questions that made him feel like he was performing surgery on himself without anesthesia. Gym at 11, in the room that had been Aisha's studio, where that streak of cerulean paint still remained like a ghost of color in his monotone world. Business calls he didn't care about at 2. And then the long stretch of evening where he used to have a wife to ignore, and now had only the echo of her absence. He'd started visiting museums, something he'd never done despite Aisha's constant invitations during their marriage. "You'd love the way Basquiat uses color," she'd said. "There's a Rothko that makes me think of you," she'd offered. He'd always been too busy, had meetings, had calls, had anything except time for art that didn't appreciate in value. Now he spent hours standing before paintings, trying to see what she'd seen, trying to understand the language she'd been speaking while he'd been deaf to everything but profit margins. It was at the Brooklyn Museum, on a Thursday afternoon, when the rain had driven most people indoors but had driven him out of his empty house, that their parallel lives finally intersected. He saw her before she saw him, and for a moment he forgot how to breathe. She stood before a Kerry James Marshall painting, wearing yellow again. She seemed to favor it now, like she was making up for all the beige years. And her hair was different, locked now, and adorned with gold cuffs that caught the museum lights. She was with a group of children, her community center class, and she was teaching them to see. "Look at how he uses black," she was saying, her voice carrying that particular warmth reserved for sharing something you love. Not as absence of color, but as presence of all colors. Black contains multitudes, remember that. A little boy, maybe 7, tugged at her sleeve. "Ms. Aisha, is that why you laugh when you're sad? 'Cause it contains multitudes." She knelt down to his level, and Aidan watched her consider the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Sometimes, Marcus, laughing and crying are so close together, they become the same thing. Like colors that look different, but come from the same light. Like you and Mr. Aidan." Aidan's breath caught. The child knew about him, about them, about the story that had become public property. "No, sweetheart," Aisha said gently. "We were different colors trying to pretend we were the same. That's why it didn't work." She stood then and saw him, their eyes meeting across 20 feet of polished floor that might as well have been an ocean. For a moment, neither moved, and the children, sensing something adult and complicated, fell silent. She didn't flee, didn't approach, simply nodded, the way you might acknowledge someone you used to know in another life, then turned back to the painting. But the boy, Marcus, had other ideas. He walked directly to Aidan with the fearlessness of children who haven't yet learned that some distances are meant to be maintained. "Are you the man who made Ms. Aisha sad?" he asked, loud enough for everyone to hear. Aidan knelt, meeting the child's eyes. "Yes." "Why?" "Because I didn't know how to see colors the way she does." Marcus considered this. "She's teaching us. Maybe she could teach you too." "Marcus," Aisha's voice was gentle but firm. "Come back to the group." But something had shifted. As she gathered the children to move to the next gallery, she paused beside Aidan. "You look different," she observed, and he knew she was cataloguing changes the way he'd done with her. The weight loss that made his suit hang wrong, the stubble he'd never have allowed before, the absence of his phone in his hand, like a missing appendage. "I'm trying to be," he replied. "Don't try to be different," she said, and for a moment her voice carried something that wasn't quite warmth, but wasn't cold either. Maybe recognition, maybe understanding, maybe just the politeness of someone who'd once shared your bed and now shared only the same city. "Try to be yourself. Though I suppose for you, that might be the same thing." She walked away, the children following like ducklings, their voices echoing in the gallery as they asked questions about color and light and why adults made everything so complicated. But one little girl hung back, pressed something into Aidan's hand, a drawing on museum notebook paper, crayon on cheap stock, but it was Aisha's face, laughing with words in careful child's handwriting. "Ms. Aisha, when she's free." He stood there holding the drawing like a man holding evidence of a crime he'd committed, watching them disappear into the next room. Then he looked back at the Kerry James Marshall painting, trying to see what she'd seen, trying to understand black as presence rather than absence. That night, Aisha painted in her studio apartment, the experience of seeing Aidan translating into color and form, not a painting of him, but of the space between them, the necessary distance that allowed for perspective. She called it Parallel Lines and posted it on Instagram with no caption, letting the image speak for itself. Two lines of color, once twisted together into an ugly knot, now running clean and separate and somehow more beautiful for their independence. Across town, Aidan sat in his home gym that had been her studio, that child's drawing taped to the mirror beside the streak of cerulean paint. He was reading Aisha's old art books, the ones she'd left behind, their margins full of her notes in that looping handwriting he'd once called charmingly old-fashioned. "Color is not decoration," she'd written beside a passage about Rothko. "It's language, it's meaning. It's the thing itself, not the thing described." He thought about calling her, about texting, about the million ways he could try to insert himself back into her life. But instead, he did something he'd never done in their 5 years of marriage. He picked up a paintbrush. Not to create art, he had no illusions about sudden talent, but to understand the weight of it in his hand, the way paint moved like liquid possibility, the distance between wanting to create something and actually creating it. He painted a single line on a canvas, crooked, uncertain, but his. That night, both of them stood at their respective windows, looking out at the same city from different angles. Somewhere between them, spring continued its work of turning dead things into living ones, of proving that endings were just beginnings wearing disguise, of insisting that parallel lines, while never meeting, could still exist in the same universe, could still be part of the same larger picture, even if they'd never touch again. The child's drawing stayed on Aidan's mirror, a reminder of what freedom looked like on the face of someone he'd helped cage. And in Aisha's apartment, the painting of parallel lines dried slowly, each strand of color maintaining its independence while acknowledging the existence of the other, like two people who'd learned that love sometimes meant letting go completely, that respect sometimes looked like distance, and that the best apology might be to simply stop trying to converge. Neither of them slept well that night, but for different reasons. Aisha because she was planning a new series about women who'd found themselves after losing everything, and Aidan because he was beginning to understand that finding yourself after you'd lost someone might be even harder than losing them in the first place. The city hummed around them, indifferent to their personal dramas, and somewhere in Brooklyn, a little boy named Marcus drew another picture. Two people standing on opposite sides of a painting, both looking at the same thing but seeing something completely different. He titled it, in careful crayon letters, "How Colors Separate." Chapter 6. The Anniversary. June 15th arrived dressed in unseasonable rain, as if the universe itself remembered what this date meant, and decided to mark it with the kind of weather that forced people indoors, into reflection, into churches where they'd once made promises they couldn't keep. Aisha hadn't planned to go to St. Augustine's. She'd woken with every intention of treating it like any other Tuesday, teaching her morning class, working on her new commission, meeting Naomi for drinks where they'd specifically not talk about what day it was. But her hands had trembled when she'd tried to paint, her colors muddying like her emotions, and before she knew it, she was on the subway, heading to the church in Brooklyn, where 6 years ago she'd walked down an aisle in her grandmother's dress, believing love could be enough if you just loved hard enough. The church sat empty at 2 in the afternoon, just as she'd hoped. Rain hammered against the stained glass windows, turning the light inside into something aqueous and dreamlike. She'd brought her travel watercolors, the set she carried everywhere now, like a smoker carries cigarettes, needing the fix of color whenever reality got too gray. She set up in the last pew, the one where Naomi had sat during the wedding, far enough back to see everything, to capture the whole story in one frame. The painting began to emerge. The ghost of a ceremony, transparent figures at the altar, everything slightly out of focus like a memory you're not sure actually happened the way you remember it. "I came to paint over the memory," she said aloud to the empty church, to God if he was listening, to herself mostly. "To revise it, to make it mine instead of ours." She was so absorbed in the work, in the way watercolor bled into itself, creating new truths from old lies, that she didn't hear the door open, didn't notice another presence until a shadow fell across her painting. "Don't," she said without looking up, recognizing the particular weight of his stillness, the way Aidan had of taking up space without moving. "Whatever you're about to say, don't. Let me finish this." He sat down, not next to her, but across the aisle, the same distance they'd been standing when they'd said their vows. She kept painting, and he kept watching, and for 20 minutes they existed in the same space without words, which was maybe the most honest their marriage had ever been. When she finally set down her brush, the painting showed what she'd intended: a wedding being erased by rain, the colors running together until you couldn't tell where the bride ended and the ghost began. She looked at it, then at him, then back at the painting. "It's our anniversary," he said unnecessarily. "I know. I didn't plan to come here either. I know that too." He looked different than he had at the museum 6 weeks ago. Still thin, still stubbled, but something else, calmer maybe, or just resigned. He wore jeans and a Columbia University sweatshirt, clothes she'd never seen him in during their marriage. He looked like a graduate student, not a millionaire, and somehow that made him more real than he'd ever been in his suits. "Dr. Cross, my therapist. She calls it anniversary syndrome," he said. "The body remembers dates even when the mind tries to forget. Is that what you're trying to do? Forget?" "No." He shifted and she noticed he was holding something, a manila envelope, aged and careful. "I'm trying to remember. Really remember, not the version I told myself." They sat in silence, the rain creating a percussion section for their non-conversation. Finally, Aisha laughed. Not the laugh from the birthday party, but something smaller, more rueful. "We're terrible at this," she said. "At what?" "Being divorced. We're supposed to hate each other, or avoid each other, or at least not end up in our wedding church on our anniversary like characters in a movie nobody would believe." "I don't hate you," Aidan said quietly. "I know, that might be worse. Hate would be easier. Hate has edges. This is just..." She gestured at the space between them. "Sad." He stood then, crossed the aisle but didn't sit down, just placed the envelope on the pew beside her painting. "I found these in the attic. Your letters. The ones you wrote me our first year when I was traveling for the Tokyo merger. I never answered them properly. I meant to, but there was always another call, another meeting, another priority," she finished. "Yes." She looked at the envelope but didn't touch it. "Why bring them now?" "Because I finally read them, really read them, not the skimming I did before. You were trying to tell me who you were, and I was too busy trying to make you who I needed you to be." He paused, ran his hand through his hair, another gesture she'd never seen during their marriage, too uncontrolled. "There's one dated from our first anniversary. You wrote about the way morning light hit our bedroom wall and how it reminded you of your mother's favorite painting. You wrote about wanting to capture that light, to paint our love story on that wall. I wrote back about the quarterly reports." Aisha picked up the envelope, felt its weight. Dozens of letters. Her heart poured out in ink, trying to reach him across distances that were more than geographical. "I was so young," she said softly, 22 and so sure love could overcome everything. Cultural differences, class differences, the way you looked through me instead of at me. I thought if I just loved you harder, painted you better, existed more beautifully, you'd finally see me." "You were beautiful," Aidan said. "Are beautiful. That was never the problem." "No," Aisha agreed. "The problem was that beautiful was all you saw. Like I was a painting you'd acquired, valuable, worth displaying, but not worth understanding." Thunder cracked overhead, and they both looked up at the stained glass windows where saints performed miracles in frozen tableau. "Can I tell you something?" Aidan asked. Something I've never told anyone. She nodded. That moment, when I hit you, I saw my father. Not metaphorically. I mean, I actually saw him standing behind you, nodding his approval. Sometimes you have to remind them who's in charge, he used to say about my mother, about his secretaries, about anyone who forgot their place in his world, and for 1 second I was him, completely him. Your laugh didn't just free you, it broke something in me too, the part that was him. And now? Now I'm trying to figure out who I am without him, without you, without the company, really. I'm selling it. Aisha turned sharply. You're what? Selling. Gabriel wants it, he's good at it. It's his dream, not mine. I never wanted to run a company. I wanted... He paused, laughed bitterly. I don't even know what I wanted. I just took what was expected. Including me? No, he said firmly. You were the only thing I chose. I just didn't know how to choose you every day after that. I thought the wedding was the choosing, not the beginning of choosing. They sat with that truth between them, heavy as the rain outside. Aisha picked up her brush again, added something to the painting. A single figure walking away from the dissolving wedding, solid and real, and moving towards something beyond the frame. I'm going to Paris, she said. The residency. I leave next month. Good. She looked at him, surprised. I mean it, he continued. It's good. You should go. You should paint every sunrise in Montmartre and laugh too loudly in cafes and be exactly who you are without anyone trying to make you smaller. What will you do? I don't know. Travel maybe, but not for business. See the museums you tried to show me. Learn to cook something besides reservations. Figure out if there's a person under all the acquisition strategies and profit margins. He stood to leave, then turned back. Can I ask you something? You've already asked me several somethings. One more. Do you ever think we could have made it? If I'd been different? If I'd seen you? Aisha considered the question, looking at her painting of their dissolving wedding, at the letters in her lap, at the man standing in the aisle where he'd once promised to love and cherish her. I think, she said slowly, we were a beautiful idea that looked perfect on paper. Rich white man, talented black woman, a modern fairy tale for a post-racial America that doesn't exist. But ideas aren't relationships. Paper isn't real life. And fairy tales. She smiled sadly. Fairy tales require magic we didn't have. We had something, he insisted. We had potential, she corrected. But potential isn't enough if you never develop it. He nodded, understanding finally that some truths couldn't be negotiated, some deals couldn't be closed, some acquisitions fell through because they were never meant to succeed. As he walked toward the door, Aisha called out, Aiden, he turned. The painting you're trying to do, yes, Gabriel told me, don't try to paint what you see. Paint what you feel, even if it's ugly, especially if it's ugly. That's where the truth lives. He smiled then, the first genuine smile she'd seen from him in years. Is that your professional artistic advice? No, she said, returning to her watercolor. That's my divorce gift. Use it well. After he left, Aisha sat in the church until the rain stopped, finishing her painting. When she finally stood to go, she left the letters on the pew, not forgotten, not discarded, but released, like prayers that had already been answered with no. Outside, the sun was breaking through clouds, turning the wet streets into mirrors. She walked through Brooklyn, carrying her painting, still wet, careful not to smudge it. People passed her on the sidewalk, and some recognized her, the woman who laughed, the artist who'd turned pain into profit, the ex-wife who'd won by losing. But Aisha didn't feel like any of those things. She felt like what she was, a woman on a Tuesday afternoon, carrying a painting of a memory she was finally ready to let dry, walking toward a future that didn't include the man she'd married, but might possibly include the person he was becoming. That night, she posted the painting online with a simple caption, Year 6, revision complete. Within an hour, it had thousands of likes and hundreds of comments. But the one that mattered most came from an account she hadn't blocked after all. Aiden MP Rat. Thank you for the gift. I'll try to deserve it. She didn't respond, but she didn't delete it either. Some conversations were finished even when they weren't over. Some stories ended even when the characters kept living, and some anniversaries were worth marking precisely because they marked the end of marking them. In his empty mansion, Aiden stood before a canvas with a single painted line, now joined by another and another, not trying to create art, but trying to create himself, one uncertain stroke at a time. The letters she'd left at the church would be found by someone, maybe, or thrown away by cleaning staff, or remain there forever, like evidence of a love that had tried so hard to exist, it forgot to actually exist. Either way, it didn't matter anymore. They were both finally coloring outside the lines they'd drawn for each other. Chapter 7. The Mother's Words. Isabella Pratt arrived at JFK Airport on a July morning so humid it felt like breathing through wet cotton, pulling a single suitcase behind her like a woman who'd learned to travel light after spending 20 years running from the weight of a marriage that had nearly killed her spirit, if not her body. She hadn't told Aiden she was coming, hadn't told Gabriel either. The only person who knew was Aisha, whom she'd found through Instagram at 3 a.m. Rome time, unable to sleep after seeing the video that had gone viral, watching her son become his father in high definition, watching another woman laugh her way to freedom the way Isabella had once cried her way to it. The message had been simple. I need to meet you. Not for him. For us. For the sisterhood of women who survived Pratt men. Now she stood outside Aisha's studio in Bedford-Stuyvesant, a 63-year-old woman who looked 50, dressed in linen the color of afternoon sunlight, her hair silver and unashamed, her face carrying lines that spoke of laughter finally earned after tears fully grieved. She knocked with hands that had once played piano in conservatories, painted in galleries, written poetry in journals that William Pratt had burned in their fireplace, while explaining that hobbies were unbecoming for a wife of his stature. Aisha opened the door in paint-splattered overalls, a brush still in her hand, yellow ochre streaking her cheek like war paint for a battle already won. Isabella, she said, not a question, but recognition. The eyes were Aiden's, that particular shade of grey that could look blue in certain light, but everything else was foreign territory, especially the smile that seemed to originate from somewhere deeper than social politeness. You're taller than I expected, Isabella said, then laughed. But then, you're standing straight. I imagine you weren't doing much of that before. Without asking, she entered the studio, taking in the controlled chaos of creation. Canvases stacked against walls, paint tubes squeezed empty like consumed possibilities, windows thrown open to let in the city's symphony of sirens and children and life happening loudly. Tea? Aisha offered, gesturing to a corner that served as a kitchen. Wine, Isabella corrected. I brought Italian, the good stuff, the stuff that makes truth easier to swallow. They sat on the floor. There was only one chair occupied by a massive canvas depicting women laughing in a thunderstorm, and Isabella pulled 2 bottles from her bag like a magician revealing secrets. I saw the video, she began without preamble, pouring wine into mason jars Aisha provided. Saw my son hit you. Saw you laugh. That laugh, ... She took a long sip. I should have laughed. 28 years ago, when William hit me for contradicting him at a dinner party. I should have laughed instead of apologizing, should have laughed instead of covering the bruise with concealer he bought me the next day, should have laughed instead of getting pregnant again, thinking a second child would make him softer. You left, though, Aisha said. Eventually. After 15 years. 15 years of shrinking myself down until I could slip through the cracks in his attention. You did it in 5. Your evolution, my dear. I'm just history. She stood, moved to Aisha's paintings, studying them with the eye of someone who understood the language of color. She stopped at a new piece, A woman's silhouette filled with other women's silhouettes, all of them walking in different directions, but somehow moving forward together. "This is us," Isabella said softly. "All of us who've been married to men who collected us like art they didn't understand." "When did you know," Aisha asked, "that you had to leave?" Isabella turned, and for a moment her composed face cracked, showing the woman underneath who'd clawed her way to freedom inch by inch. The day Aidan turned 13, William was teaching him to be a man, his version of it. "I heard him tell our son that women were like businesses. You had to manage them properly or they'd run wild, become unprofitable. And Aidan, my sweet boy, who used to bring me flowers he'd picked from neighbors' gardens, nodded, just nodded, like it made sense. That's when I knew I had to leave, but it took 2 more years to find the courage." "Does he know, Aidan, about what his father was really like?" "He knows facts, that William was controlling, that I left, that the divorce was brutal, but knowing and understanding are different countries with closed borders." Isabella returned to the floor, poured more wine. "Tell me about my son, not the one I read about in business magazines, the one you married." So Aisha told her. About the man who'd seemed so different from what she'd expected when they'd met at that gallery opening, how he'd asked genuine questions about her work, about the slow dissolution, like sugar in water, sweet at first, then simply gone, about the midnight painting sessions and the morning apologies for existing too loudly, about the birthday party, the slap, the laugh that changed everything. "He's in therapy now," Aisha finished. "Gabriel says he's trying to change." "They always try after you're gone," Isabella said with the wisdom of experience, "when trying costs them nothing but the effort of trying." "That's not fair." "Isn't it?" Isabella interrupted. "Did he try when you were there? Did he try when trying would have meant choosing you over a meeting, your art over his comfort, your fullness over his need for you to be less?" The truth of it sat between them like a third presence. Outside, someone was playing music too loudly, the bass thumping through the walls like a heartbeat. "I still love him," Aisha admitted, surprising herself with the honesty. "Not in a way that wants him back, but in a way that grieves what we could have been if we'd been different people." "That's the cruelest love," Isabella agreed, "the love of potential. I loved William's potential for 20 years, loved the man he could be if he just tried, if he just saw me, but potential is just another word for disappointment waiting to happen." She pulled out her phone, showed Aisha photos of her life in Rome. A small apartment overlooking a piazza, paintings covering every wall, her own work, restarted at 45, a garden where she grew tomatoes and basil, a younger man, handsome in an earthy way, his arm around her in casual intimacy. "That's Marco," she said, smiling. "He's a baker, never finished high school, makes me laugh every morning and sees my art before he sees my aging. William would die if he knew. Actually, he did die. Heart attack at his desk 5 years ago, but he would die again." "I'm going to Paris," Aisha said. "The residency I was accepted to. Good. Go. Create. Be so bright they need sunglasses to look at you." Isabella stood, prepared to leave, then turned back. "Can I buy that painting? The one with women walking in different directions." "It's not for sale. I'll pay what it's worth to you, not what the market says." "What's it worth to you?" Isabella considered. "Freedom, recognition, the knowledge that I'm not alone in this particular survival." Aisha wrapped the painting carefully. "Then it's yours, a gift from one survivor to another." Isabella hugged her then, fierce and maternal and understanding all at once. "He'll come to you," she warned. "When he hears I was here, he'll want to know what I said, what you said, what it means. Don't let him make my visit about him. This was about us." After she left, Aisha stood in her studio surrounded by the work of her freedom, thinking about patterns and inheritance, about men who learned to acquire instead of love, about women who learned to laugh instead of cry. Her phone buzzed. "Aiden, my mother is in New York. Did she contact you?" She typed back, "Yes." 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Finally, what did she want? Aisha thought about all the ways she could answer. The truth, a lie, a deflection. Instead, she sent a photo of the empty space where the painting had been, the ghost of it still visible on the wall. "To take what was hers," she wrote. "Something you'd understand." The dots appeared again, but no message came. Good. Some conversations didn't need words, just like some marriages didn't need to last, and some women didn't need permission to be free. That night, across the ocean, Isabella Pratt hung her new painting in her Roman apartment, right where the morning light would hit it. She opened a bottle of wine, the 3rd from her bag, the one she'd saved, and toasted the women, walking in different directions, all moving forward. In Brooklyn, Aisha painted Through the Night, a new piece inspired by Isabella's visit. A mother bird teaching her daughter to fly by, flying away first. She titled it Inheritance, and knew without asking that Isabella would understand. And in his Manhattan mansion, Aiden Pratt sat in his father's old study, looking at photo albums his mother had left behind when she fled. In every picture she was getting smaller, dimmer, less present, until the final photos where she was merely a shadow at the edge of family portraits. He thought about calling her, about calling Aisha, about calling someone who could tell him how to fix what had been broken before he was even born. Instead, he did what both women had done in their own ways. He picked up a brush and painted his own dissolution, one imperfect stroke at a time, learning that sometimes the only way to break a pattern was to break yourself first and see what remained. Chapter 8. The Dance Class. The Riverside Community Center inhabited a building that had been many things: a bank in the 1920s, a department store in the 1950s, abandoned in the 1980s, and finally reborn as a place where art and movement collided in rooms that still smelled faintly of their previous lives, like old perfume in an attic trunk. Aisha had been teaching there for 3 months now, her Wednesday evening art class for adults who'd forgotten they were creative, running back to back with a salsa dance class that leaked rhythm through the thin walls, like joy, refusing to be contained. She'd grown used to the soundtrack, painting to the clave beat, her students' brushstrokes unconsciously syncing with the music next door. It was August now, the city sweating through another heat wave that made everyone move slower except the dancers, who seemed to generate their own weather system of passion and percussion. Aisha was cleaning brushes, her last student gone, when Magdalena, the dance instructor, burst through the door like a force of nature in a red dress that moved like liquid fire. "Aisha, mi amor, I need you," she announced, grabbing Aisha's paint-stained hands with her perfectly manicured ones. "My assistant broke his ankle, men and they're showing off, and I have a class full of beginners who need partners. You dance, yes? I paint, Magdalena, you know this. Everyone dances, some just don't know it yet. Come, just for tonight. You can paint sadness later. Right now, we make joy." Which is how Aisha found herself in the dance studio, still wearing her paint-splattered jeans and tank top, surrounded by mirrors that reflected back a woman she was still learning to recognize, someone who took up space unapologetically, whose body moved without seeking permission. The class was the usual Wednesday mix: divorce refugees, empty nesters, young professionals trying to be interesting on dating apps. They stood in awkward clusters, avoiding eye contact, that particular brand of adult discomfort that came from being beginners at something. "Tonight," Magdalena announced, clapping her hands like a flamenco general commanding troops, "we learn to trust. Salsa is not steps. Salsa is conversation between bodies. You must listen with more than ears." She began pairing people up, her choices seemingly random, but probably orchestrated by some matchmaking algorithm only she understood. Aisha helped demonstrate the basic steps, muscle memory from her childhood returning. Her father had taught her to salsa in their kitchen, her mother singing along to Celia Cruz while stirring pots that bubbled with the same rhythm. She was adjusting an older woman's frame when she heard Magdalena's voice carry across the room. "You in the corner, hiding like a shadow. Yes, you. You dance with—" She paused dramatically, scanning the room, and Aisha knew, with the certainty of someone who'd learned the universe had a twisted sense of humor, what was about to happen. "You dance with Aisha." She turned, and there was Aidan, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else, in a board meeting, a tax audit, hell itself, than in a beginner's salsa class, wearing khakis and a Columbia t-shirt dark with sweat. Their eyes met across the studio, and for a moment the music seemed to skip like a scratched record. He started to speak, probably to explain or apologize or flee, but Magdalena was having none of it. "No talking! Dancing is better than words. Words lie, bodies tell truth." So they stood facing each other, two people who'd shared a bed for 5 years but had never really touched. Not like this, not with intention and attention and the awkwardness of strangers who used to be everything. "I didn't know you taught here," he said quietly, his hand hovering near her waist like it was asking permission. "I didn't know you danced," she replied, placing her hand in his, noting the calluses that hadn't been there before. From painting, she realized. He'd been painting enough to change his hands. "I don't. But Dr. Cross said I needed to do something physical that wasn't about control or winning. Something where I had to follow instead of lead." "And you chose salsa?" Despite everything, she almost smiled. "The man who color-coded our spice rack chose salsa? Gabriel suggested it. He failed to mention you taught next door." "Gabriel," they said in unison, and for a moment the shared exasperation at his meddling brother created a bridge between them, gossamer thin, but there. Magdalena started the music, something slow for beginners, but with enough heat to make the mirrors fog slightly. Basic step first. Leaders, though we don't like that word, we prefer initiators, you suggest. Followers, though we prefer interpreters, you decide. Remember, this is conversation, not monologue. Aidan stepped forward, Aisha stepped back, and for the first time in their entire relationship, they moved together. It was clumsy at first, his lead too forceful, her resistance automatic. But slowly, measure by measure, something shifted. He softened his frame, stopped trying to push her through the movements. She stopped anticipating where he'd go wrong, started actually listening to the suggestion in his hands. "You're different," he said, after they'd managed 8 bars without stepping on each other. "So are you." And he was. The Aidan she'd married would never have submitted to being bad at something in public, would never have worn khakis that didn't fit right, would never have let her see him sweat, literally or metaphorically. This Aidan stumbled, laughed at himself, adjusted when corrected, and when Magdalena shouted, "Switch partners!" he let her go without trying to hold on. She danced with a retired postal worker who told her about his grandchildren. Then, a young woman who was getting married next month and wanted to surprise her fiancé. Then, a middle-aged man who'd promised his dying wife he'd learn to dance after she was gone. But she kept tracking Aidan in the mirrors, watching him struggle with a woman who clearly knew more than she'd let on, seeing him navigate being the one who didn't know what he was doing. When Magdalena called for another switch and they found each other again, he was laughing, actually laughing, at something his previous partner had said. "Mrs. Chen just told me I danced like a robot having a seizure," he said, and the smile on his face was so genuine, so unlike the calculated expressions of their marriage, that Aisha felt something in her chest crack slightly. Not her heart, she wouldn't let it be her heart, but something adjacent to it. She's not wrong, Aisha said, adjusting his frame. You're thinking too much. Stop trying to solve salsa like it's a problem. Everything's a problem if you look at it right, or nothing is if you look at it differently. They danced through 3 more songs, and with each one, the awkwardness diminished. Not replaced by intimacy, that ship had sailed, hit an iceberg and sunk, but by something else. Recognition, maybe. 2 people who'd been married to strangers getting to know each other for the first time. "Why are you really here?" she asked, during a turn that brought them closer than they'd been since the slap. Truth? Novel concept for us, but sure. He was quiet for a full 8 count, then, "I'm trying to learn how to not be in charge. How to respond instead of direct. How to be present in my body instead of living in my head. And..." He paused, spun her out and back. "I'm trying to do things that William Pratt would have rather died than do. And salsa is one of them. Salsa taught by a Puerto Rican woman in a community center in a neighborhood he would have called unfortunate. He's probably spinning in his grave fast enough to power Manhattan." Despite herself, Aisha laughed. Not the laugh that had freed her, but something smaller, realer. The laugh of someone recognizing another person's growth. "I leave for Paris in 2 weeks, she said, not sure why she was telling him. "I know. Gabriel mentioned it. He also mentioned you're having a goodbye show at the gallery. Are you planning to come? Would you want me to?" She considered this as Magdalena called out corrections in Spanglish that somehow made perfect sense. "I don't not want you to come," she said finally, "which I realize is a double negative and terrible grammar and probably confusing." "It's honest," he interrupted, "which is more than we usually managed." The class was ending. Students thanking Magdalena, gathering their things, returning to lives where they didn't have to trust strangers with their balance. Aisha started to leave, but Aidan caught her hand. Not grabbing, just touching, a question more than a statement. "Can I tell you something?" he asked. She nodded. "That laugh, your laugh at the party, I hear it every day. But not in a bad way anymore. It's like an alarm clock, reminding me to wake up, to actually be awake. Does that make sense?" "Yes," she said simply, because it did. Because she understood living with ghosts that were actually teachers, wounds that were actually doorways. She left him there in the studio, still sweating, still processing, still becoming whoever he was going to be. But as she gathered her art supplies from next door, she could see him through the doorway, standing in front of the mirrors, practicing the basic step alone, counting under his breath, trying to learn the language of leading by learning to follow his own rhythm first. That night, she painted 2 figures dancing, but they were facing away from each other, dancing with invisible partners, moving to the same music but in different directions. She called it parallel movement and posted it without commentary. Within minutes, a comment appeared from Aidan M. Pratt. "Same song, different dance." She didn't reply, but she didn't delete it either. Some conversations happened in movement rather than words, in the space between steps, in the trust required to let someone else suggest a direction, even when you reserved the right to interpret it your own way. 2 weeks, then Paris, then a life without these accidental intersections, these moments of seeing him become someone she might have liked if they'd met now instead of then. But that was the thing about timing. It was never wrong, just inconvenient. They'd met when they were who they were, married as those people, divorced as evolutions of them, and now were dancing, literally and figuratively, as strangers who knew each other's deepest shames and were somehow still willing to share a rhythm, even if they'd never again share a life. Magdalena found her as she was leaving. "That man," she said, nodding toward the studio where Aidan was still practicing. "He watches you like you're a painting he's trying to understand." "He never understood my paintings," Aisha replied. "No," Magdalena agreed, "but maybe he's finally learning how to look." Chapter 9. The Truth Session. The text from Gabriel came at 3 a.m., 3 days before Aisha's farewell exhibition. Sophia's making her move. Emergency board meeting Friday at 7 p.m. She has enough votes. You need to be there. Aidan read it from his new apartment, a 2-bedroom in Brooklyn he'd rented month to month, far from the mansion that echoed with ghosts. The walls were bare except for his attempts at painting, crude things that looked like a child's fever dreams, but were his, entirely his. He'd been awake anyway, mixing colors on a palette, trying to understand how Aisha had seen the world in such vivid hues while he'd been living in grayscale. Friday at 7 p.m., the same time as Aisha's exhibition opening. Of course. He texted back, "Let her have it." His phone immediately rang. Gabriel's voice was strained, exhausted. "Have you lost your mind? It's our father's company. Your company. She's going to gut it, sell it off piece by piece like carrion." Good metaphor. Appropriate even. "Aidan, I'm serious. She's been planning this for months. Ever since the video went viral, she's been convincing investors you're unstable, that the company needs fresh leadership. She's got Harrison Wells in her pocket and at least 6 other board members." Aidan set down his paintbrush, looked at the canvas where he'd been trying to paint what shame looked like, red mostly, with veins of black running through it like poison. "Do you know what Dad's last words were?" Aidan asked. "What does that have to do with—" "His last words were, 'Check the Nikkei.' He died at his desk, and his last thought was about Japanese stock prices. That's the legacy you want me to fight for." "It's not about Dad. It's about not letting Sophia win." "This isn't a game, Gabriel. There's no winning. There's just choosing what kind of person you want to be when you wake up tomorrow." Silence on the other end. Then, "You're really going to choose her art show over the company?" "I'm choosing to stop being someone who thinks that's a choice." He hung up, turned back to his painting. The shame was wrong, too obvious, too literal. He painted over it, let the colors muddy into something brown and uncertain. Better. Truth was rarely clear. By Friday afternoon, the business news was buzzing. Hostile takeover at Pratt Industries. Sophia Winters makes power play. Aidan Pratt, MIA as company hangs in balance. His phone had 47 missed calls, 123 unread messages. He turned it off, put on the one suit he'd kept. Not the expensive Italian ones, but an off-the-rack thing he'd bought at a department store, trying to learn how normal people shopped. The Morrison Gallery was packed when he arrived, a line of people waiting to get in. He recognized some faces from their old life, society people who'd come for the scandal as much as the art. But most were strangers, drawn by Aisha's story, by her work, by the universal experience of breaking free from whatever cage they'd been living in. He stayed outside at first, watching through the window. Aisha moved through the crowd like light through water, wearing gold. Not jewelry, but the color itself. A dress that made her look like she'd been dipped in sunset. Her hair was up, revealing the neck he'd kissed 1,000 times without really feeling it. The shoulders that had carried more weight than he'd ever acknowledged. "You coming in, or just stalking?" Naomi stood beside him, arms crossed, protective as always. She'd never liked him, even during the good times, if there had been good times. Maybe she'd just seen the ending from the beginning. "I wasn't sure I'd be welcome," he admitted. "You're not," she said bluntly. "But she left you on the list. +1 even, though I can't imagine who you'd bring." "I came alone." "Story of your life, isn't it?" He deserved that, so he just nodded. Naomi softened slightly, not much but enough. "She's different now," she said. "Not better. She was always good, just more herself, more free, more everything she wasn't allowed to be with you." "I know." "Do you? Because showing up here feels like you're trying to insert yourself back into her story." "I'm not," Aidan said, surprising himself with the truth of it. I'm just trying to witness the ending, to see what she becomes without me, to applaud it, even if it hurts." Naomi studied him for a long moment. "You've changed too." "I'm trying." "Try harder," she said, but stood aside to let him pass. Inside, the gallery had been transformed. The paintings were arranged not chronologically, but emotionally, creating a journey from captivity to freedom that you could walk through like stations of the cross. But it was the new work that stopped people in their tracks. Paintings of Paris already, though she hadn't gone yet. Imaginary futures painted in colors that didn't exist in nature, but should. "She painted those this week," Vivian Cross said, appearing at his elbow with champagne he didn't take, like she's already there in her mind, already gone. "Good," he said, meaning it. At exactly 7 p.m., his phone buzzed in his pocket. The board meeting starting, Sophia probably wearing red, her power color, standing at the head of the table that had been his father's, his grandfather's, making her case for why Aidan Pratt was unfit to lead. The others nodding, already decided, the vote a formality. He turned his phone off completely. "Ladies and gentlemen," Vivian called out, clinking a glass, "our artist would like to say a few words." Aisha moved to the center of the room, and the crowd quieted like she was a conductor raising a baton. She saw him then, standing in the back, and something flickered across her face. Not surprise, he realized. She'd known he'd come, had maybe even counted on it. "6 months ago," she began, her voice carrying that particular strength that came from having nothing left to lose. "I laughed my way out of a marriage. Not because it was funny, but because I finally understood the joke. I'd been trying to paint myself into someone else's picture instead of creating my own canvas." A few people turned to look at him, recognizing him from the video. He kept his eyes on Aisha. "These paintings," she continued, "aren't about revenge or anger or even pain, though those emotions are in here. They're about the moment you realize you've been living in translation, constantly converting yourself into a language someone else can understand, and you decide to speak your native tongue even if no one else knows the words." She talked about Paris, about new beginnings, about the women who'd reached out to share their own stories of resurrection. She thanked people, Naomi, Vivian, her parents, even Isabella Pratt, who'd sent a congratulatory note from Rome. She didn't mention him, which was exactly right. He wasn't part of this story anymore. But then she did something unexpected. She walked to a covered painting at the back of the gallery, one that hadn't been unveiled. "This last piece," she said, "isn't for sale. It's called Forgiveness, but not the kind you might think. Not forgiving him. That's not mine to give or withhold. It's forgiving myself for the years I spent becoming smaller, quieter, less. For the times I painted beige when I dreamed in purple. For every time I laughed politely when I wanted to scream beautifully." She pulled away the covering, and the room gasped collectively. The painting showed 2 figures, but they weren't together. They were on opposite sides of the canvas, separated by what looked like a river of color. The figure on the left was dissolving, becoming part of the background, muted and careful. The figure on the right was exploding outward, colors radiating like a human aurora borealis. But what made people lean in, what made them pull out their phones to capture it, was that both figures were laughing. Different laughs, one desperate and trapped, one free and soaring, but both true. "The thing about ending a marriage," Aisha said, looking directly at him now, "is that you're not just leaving a person. You're leaving a version of yourself. And sometimes that version deserves compassion too, even if you can never be her again." The room erupted in applause. People surrounded her, congratulating, purchasing, celebrating. Aidan stayed where he was, looking at the painting, understanding finally that forgiveness wasn't about reconciliation, it was about release. His phone buzzed again. "Gabriel, it's done. She won. Company's hers. Where the fuck are you?" He typed back, Exactly where I'm supposed to be. He started to leave. This was Aisha's night, not his, but she appeared at his elbow, holding 2 glasses of champagne. You chose this over the board meeting, she said. Not a question. There was no choice, just clarity about what matters. Sophia owns your father's company now. My father's company, he repeated. Never mine. I was just wearing it like an inheritance that didn't fit. They stood together, not touching, but not separate, watching people discover her work, watching her future unfold in real time. I'm proud of you, he said quietly, not in a possessive way, not as your ex-husband, just as someone who witnessed you become this. Whatever this magnificent thing is you've become. She was quiet for a moment then. I painted something for you. Not about you, for you. She led him to a small canvas in the corner, barely visible behind larger works. It was abstract mostly, but he could make out what might be a figure learning to walk or dance, or simply stand. The colors were uncertain but hopeful, like dawn when you're not sure if it's going to rain or shine. It's called beginning, she said. It's what you're doing now, beginning to be whoever you actually are under all that acquisition and ambition. I don't know who that is yet. That's the point, neither did I. But look, she gestured around the gallery, at her work, her truth made visible. Eventually, you figure it out. Someone called her name, an important collector, Vivian mouthing, "Please come," over the crowd. Aisha started to go, then turned back. For what it's worth, she said, I think you made the right choice tonight. Not for me, for you. She disappeared into the crowd, pulled into conversations and congratulations, her future opening like a flower that had been waiting for the right season. Aidan stayed a moment longer, looking at the painting she'd made for him, not forgiveness exactly, but acknowledgement. Recognition that he was trying to become something more than his father's son, his company's CEO, her ex-husband. Outside, the summer night was thick with humidity and possibility. He walked toward the subway, past a notification on his phone from the Wall Street Journal. Pratt Industries takeover complete, Sophia Winters named CEO. He deleted it without reading, then did something he'd never done in his adult life. He took the long way home, walking through Brooklyn as it came alive on a Friday night, watching people live their messy, uncontrolled, beautiful lives. At a corner bodega, he bought a notebook and a pen. Sitting on a bench under a streetlight, he began to write. Not a business plan or an acquisition strategy, but words that had been building in him like steam in a kettle. Words about shame and recognition, about the difference between owning and loving, about the sound of a woman's laugh echoing through an empty mansion. He wrote until his hand cramped, until the streetlight flickered, until the city settled into its 2 a.m. quiet. Then he walked to his apartment, to his terrible paintings and his rented furniture, and his life that was no longer about winning or losing, but simply about being. The last thing he wrote, before sleep finally came. She forgave herself tonight. Maybe someday I'll learn to do the same. Chapter 10. The Second Birthday. 1 year later, Aisha Dean stands in the same Pratt Mansion ballroom where everything ended and began, but this time she owns the space in ways that have nothing to do with property deeds or marriage certificates. She owns it because she's been invited here to Sophia Winters Pratt's spectacular downfall, and she's come dressed in the same yellow she wore to freedom. The invitation had arrived at her Paris apartment 3 weeks ago, forwarded by Naomi with a note. You need to see this. Inside, elegant script on cream paper. The honor of your presence is requested at the liquidation gala of Pratt Industries. Celebrate the end of an era. Sophia, in her hubris, is throwing a party for her failure. The company she'd schemed to steal has collapsed in 11 months, a spectacular implosion of bad investments, alienated partners, and the kind of greed that consumes itself. The board members who'd supported her have fled like rats from a sinking yacht. Harrison Wells faces federal investigation, and Sophia, whose family fortune was tied to Pratt Industries stock, has lost everything. She's actually celebrating bankruptcy, Naomi whispers beside Aisha, both of them standing at the entrance to the ballroom that's been decorated like a funeral, and a wedding had a child raised by wolves. The absolute delusion. But Aisha understands something Naomi doesn't. This isn't celebration. It's Sophia's last desperate grab at controlling the narrative. If she throws the party, she's not the victim. She's still the one making choices, even if the only choice left is how to fall. The room fills with vultures dressed in designer clothing, come to witness the final act of a tragedy that started with ambition and ends with auction notices. Everything will be sold next week. The mansion, the art, the furniture where Aisha once sat pretending to be less than she was. And then Sophia appears at the top of the stairs, wearing the same red dress from that birthday party a year and a half ago, the night of the slap. The dress hangs differently now, Sophia having lost weight the way desperate people do, becoming sharp where she was once curved, brittle where she was once bold. "Welcome," she calls out, her voice carrying that particular brightness of someone who's chosen madness over admission, "to the end of the patriarchy." A few people laugh nervously, most just stare. The Pratt Empire, built on the backs of bitter men and broken women, officially dies tonight, Sophia continues, descending the stairs with practiced grace that can't quite hide the tremor in her hands. "And I killed it. Me. Not the market, not bad luck, not even my own incompetence, though that played a part." She laughs, and it's wrong, like a piano with broken keys trying to play a familiar song. "But before we dance on this grave, I want to acknowledge someone special, someone whose laugh started all of this." Her eyes find Aisha in the crowd. "Aisha Dean, the woman who got away. Come up here, darling. Let's give the people what they want. A confrontation between the wife and the mistress." "I was never the mistress," Aisha says, her voice carrying across the silent room. "I was the wife. You were always the ghost in our marriage, the standard I couldn't meet because I was real and you were fantasy." She walks toward the stairs, and the crowd parts. She's different than she was at the birthday party, not smaller or larger, just complete. Paris has gilded her with confidence that comes from a year of being exactly who she is, celebrated for it, paid well for it. "You're right, though," Aisha continues, climbing the stairs to stand beside Sophia. "My laugh did start this, but not how you think." She turns to address the room, these people who'd watched her get slapped and done nothing, who'd eaten at her table while she disappeared course by course. 18 months ago, in this room, my ex-husband hit me because you," she looks at Sophia, "suggested he couldn't control me, and I laughed because I realized something beautiful. I didn't need to be controlled. I didn't need his money or his name or his approval. I needed to paint, to create, to be." She pulls out her phone, shows an image to the crowd. Her latest exhibition in Paris, sold out, written about in Le Monde as revolutionary vulnerability made visible. "That laugh saved me, led me to Paris, to art, to myself. But you," she turns back to Sophia, "you thought winning meant taking his company, his money, his life. You thought the opposite of being controlled was being the controller." Sophia's face shifts, the mask cracking. "I won. I took everything from him. You took nothing," Aisha says gently, almost pitying, "because Aiden had already let it go. He's in California now, did you know? Teaching art therapy to veterans, living in a studio apartment, dating a kindergarten teacher who makes him laugh. He sends me paintings sometimes. They're terrible, but getting better. He's happy, Sophia, actually happy." "That's not winning." "No," Aisha agrees. "It's living, something you never learned to do." The room holds its breath. Sophia raises her hand, the same gesture Aiden had made, ready to slap, but Aisha catches her wrist, gently, firmly, and then Aisha laughs. Not cruelly, not triumphantly, but with genuine warmth. "Oh, Sophia, you're still trying to live in that moment, aren't you? The slap, the power, the control. But that moment's over. It ended the second I laughed the first time." She releases Sophia's wrist, turns to the room. "You all came here to watch someone fall, to celebrate failure, to feel superior to someone who reached too high and crashed. But look around. You're in a mansion that's being auctioned, drinking champagne that won't be paid for, celebrating the end of something that was already dead." She descends the stairs, stops at the bottom, looks back up at Sophia, who stands frozen, a woman in a red dress with nowhere left to fall because she's already hit bottom and decorated it with party streamers. "The real revenge," Aisha says, loud enough for everyone to hear, "isn't taking what someone else built. It's building something they could never imagine. It's becoming someone they could never be. It's laughing your way to freedom and then actually being free." She walks through the ballroom, past the piano nobody plays, past the windows where she'd once watched her life pass by, past the spot where she'd been slapped and reborn simultaneously. At the door, she turns one last time. Sophia has collapsed onto the stairs, the pretense finally abandoned, sobbing with the kind of grief that comes from winning the wrong prize. The guests are already leaving, uncomfortable with genuine emotion in a room built for performance. "Happy birthday to me," Aisha says quietly, because it is her 29th birthday, and she's giving herself the gift of walking away from this story entirely. Outside, Naomi waits with a car running. The airport? The airport. As they drive away, Aisha doesn't look back at the mansion. She's learned that freedom isn't about what you leave behind, it's about what you move toward. And she's moving toward Paris, toward paint-stained mornings, toward a life where her laugh is just a laugh, not a revolution. Her phone buzzes. A text from Aidan. "Saw the news about tonight. Hope you're okay." She types back. "More than okay. Free." 3 dots appear then. "Me too. Finally. Me too." She deletes the thread, not from anger, but from completion. Some stories need endings, not epilogues. The plane lifts off 3 hours later, New York falling away beneath her like a dress she's outgrown. In her bag, a fresh canvas and new paints, ready for whatever comes next. She laughs, softly, privately, just for herself, at the thought that the best revenge was never revenge at all. It was simply becoming exactly who she was always meant to be, and letting everyone else deal with who they'd chosen to become. The laugh that saved her echoes somewhere over the Atlantic, heading toward a future painted in colors that haven't been named yet, in a language she's still learning to speak, in a life that's finally, completely, brilliantly her own.